Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel for this episode of Ships of War, the series in which I examine historical warships, situating them within their historical context and time period, but also looking at the manner in which they have been represented in a particular gaming system. And of course, as is my habit, I will look at just about anything from the famous, the not so famous, and the downright notorious in some cases. And today, as you can see from the ship data cards I have in front of you, I will be comparing the Japanese pre-dreadnought battleship Mikasa with her Russian counterpart Kniaz Suvorov. Now, this is an episode I've been looking forward to for a very long time because these are battleships that I find very, very interesting in a period which is heavily populated by very interesting battleships. It's also a great pleasure to do this because those of you who have seen my previous videos will recognize these ship cards. They come from the game Dreadnoughts, Fortresses of Steel, which is not actually published yet. And the designers, Rolf Grein and Nick Salmon, had very, very kindly given me the opportunity to do some videos looking at and play testing their game design. And it's a design which I'm happy to say has pretty much become one of my favorite card-driven naval war games. So fingers crossed as ever for them getting this game published. But on to the analysis. So most historians and naval buffs, and probably most people with a passing interest in naval history, will recognize the conflict from which these ships hail. Some of you may even have been lucky enough to have visited the Mikasa because she is preserved as a museum ship in Japan. So I speak, of course, of the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. Which, as we all know, was a resounding, if painfully costly, victory for the Japanese. The naval side, in particular, deserves mention because, of course, both these ships fought each other at the Battle of Tsushima in May 1905. And Tsushima is really one of those names that deserves to be as famous as Trafalgar, but for various reasons it's not. And the reason I bring up the battle now is, of course, it has a direct relevance to any analysis of these two ships because, of course, both were the fleet flagships of their respective sides of that battle. Both quite literally traded fire with each other, so it doesn't get better than that for a comparative purpose. But I want to discuss the outcome of the battle from the start because the problem, as always, with crushingly one-sided naval victories is that they inevitably obscure a lot of the follow-up perceptions of the battle, and they can even seep into technical considerations. And it's very easy for Tsushima to leave behind the impression that, among other things, the Japanese ships were wonderful. In many respects, they were, but they were far from perfect. And that the Russian ships were pretty terrible. Again, there were serious problems with many of the ships in the Russian fleet. And even these ships, the four battleships of the Borodino class, of which Kniaz Suvorov was one, they did have their problems. Yes, there were some rather major design flaws built into them, but they were not terrible ships. And I'm hoping that in today's comparative analysis, I can flesh these thoughts out a bit using the system that Nick and Rolf have put together. So, just a very little bit of history about the two ships before I kick off with looking at the data cards and what they've got to show us. So, these two ships lead extraordinarily parallel lives until you get to the point where the Battle of Tsushima is fought and the Kniaz Suvorov is lost, and the Mikasa then goes on to live I won't say a long, happy, and fulfilling life, because she was actually sunk accidentally a few months after her glowing victory at Tsushima. And although she survived beyond the Second World War after being raised and repaired, she very nearly came to grief in the aftermath of the Second World War. And it was only through very strenuous efforts that she was restored to her present state as a museum ship. But the fact is, at the end of the day, she is still here, and the Kniaz Suvorov is still at the bottom of the sea. So Mikasa is the slightly older of the two vessels. She's completed in 1902 by Vickers in Britain. At this stage, the Empire of Japan did not possess the capability to build its own battleships, and so they were still ordering major warships from Britain. By the time of the Russo-Japanese War, Britain had become the primary supplier of Japanese warships. And with battleships, they were exclusively British. The 6 battleships that the Japanese started the war with were all British designs, and Mikasa was the latest in this series. So she's completed and enters service fully operational in 1902. And she is very highly regarded. She's well built, well constructed. There's very few criticisms of her, and although she's broadly similar to the Japanese battleships that preceded her, Asahi being the one that was entered service immediately before her, she embodies all these minor improvements that were not seen in the previous ships. A noticeable one, not a very visual one, is improvements to the protection of her secondary armament. Her secondary guns are much better defended against incoming fire than those of her half-sisters, and we'll be looking at why that is a bit later on. Now, the Borodino, as I say, comes along a couple of years later. She is completed in something of a rush in 1904, so that the Borodino class, the construction of this class begins before the Russo-Japanese War, but the war and the rather bad way the naval war goes for the Russians in the early part of the conflict forces an acceleration in the construction of these ships. So they're pretty much rushed into service towards the end of 1904 and almost immediately sent out as part of the so-called Second Pacific Squadron. They are highly regarded as a design. They are supposed to be an improvement on the battleship Cesarevich, which was a French-built battleship designed and built for the Imperial Russian Navy. Unfortunately, despite outward appearances, they're actually not an improvement on the Cesarevich, and in some critical respects, which we'll also look at in a moment, they are actually worse than the Cesarevich. So in attempting to build upon what they'd learned from a French design, I'm afraid in one or two respects the Russians did get it wrong. However, on paper, the ships are very evenly matched. They have a similar speed, they have a similar armament. If you look at the sheer tonnage of armor worked into their design, they are in theory identically well protected. So how does this hold up when we get to the nitty-gritty of it all? Well, I'll start by just giving you a view of the two ships. Now, of course, there's the lovely graphics that you find on the data cards in Rolf and Nick's game. And these are really nice. I love the illustrations. They're good representations of both ships. But I always like to show photographs as well. So to introduce Mikasa first, here she is in 1902. And she's still in British waters when this is taken. In fact, the photographer has had a slight error when he's scratched her name onto the negative. But you can see a very handsome looking vessel, very quintessentially British as battleship designs go. It's the classic, main turrets disposed one forward, one aft, the secondary armament, which is a bit difficult to see in this photograph, clustered around the center. If you'd painted her in slightly different colours and hidden her in among any British squadron, she would have blended in quite well. Now let's compare her with Kniaz Suvorov. This picture was taken also when the Suvorov was brand spanking new. It's in the Baltic, and you can see a very, very different looking battleship. There's a very different design philosophy at play here to the British one. And for those of you who know and love your French warships in this period, the classic French influences of secondary armament disposed in smaller turrets along the center of the ship, the very high hull with very pronounced tumble home. That's the curvature of the hull when you look at it in cross section. She's a very French looking warship, even though this one is a homegrown Russian one. So quite a different ship. Now, why did they go for this tumble home design? A lot of it from the French side, particularly, was an effort to play with the competing requirements of seaworthiness. A higher hull gives you better command and better field of fire. Also, in theory, gives you better seakeeping, but then you run into stability issues, which the French tried very hard to address. And also, they were looking not just at seakeeping, but the attainment of good speed and good wave breaking performance. So all of these elements tie up into the French experimentation with tumble home type hulls. And you can actually see, if you look near the after end of the ship's superstructure, that tumble home continues up all the way up there until it finally straightens in the upper superstructure. So there's a very interesting form going on there. And you've even got this space for the base for the middle of the secondary guns. So a very interesting way to build a battleship. And the French turned out quite a few of these types. The British, I would say, were broadly more cautious in how they designed battleships. And once they'd settled on something they liked, this pattern, they tended to stick to it. The French were a bit more innovative, but not always for the better, as we'll see. So what about the stats of these ships and how they're presented in the game? Well, I suppose a good thing to start with is for those of you who might not have seen my introductory video concerning this game and what the cards mean, I will just take you quickly on a tour of the anatomy of a ship card. So that bit there is for your crew counter if you have a veteran or an inexperienced crew. That doesn't really concern us for this analysis, so I'll leave that to one side. You then have various locations. These are all areas on the ship that can be damaged, and each one is marked with an armor rating. I'll come back to these when I'm discussing the armor protection of the ships. So you've got your above water locations, you have the ship's flotation, how many hits it can take before serious flooding occurs. That is the straddle level. It's only to mark how well your heavy guns are ranging in. So I'll leave that one for now. There's a little box giving the ship's armament and its game stats. That is the fire level tracker, special notes, target size and profile. That's for the purposes of ranging in again. That icon is marked if you suffer a steering casualty, and that is a record of the ship's speed. So first of all, let's look at flotation, because it's interesting. Both ships have been given the same number of flotation boxes, which is a record of how much they can take by way of water ingress before they sink. Now, as far as we are aware today, and there is quite a bit of conflicting information, particularly about the Russian ships, the Mikasa was somewhat better subdivided than the Kniaz Suvorov. She had an advantage in the number of watertight bulkheads she had, and also the cellular double bottoms, which both ships were equipped with. somewhat more comprehensive flooding defences in the Mikasa. That said, given the types of damage that both ships could be expected to receive in combat and the weaponry at the time, it's highly debatable as to whether Mikasa's advantages on paper translated into anything real in game terms. And just to show you how close it actually was, I'm going to bring in my friend Fred Jane again. Now, I have used Fred Jane in these series before, but for those of you who might not have seen the other episodes, the pros and cons of Fred Jane, he was a very astute naval observer in his day. He died in the middle of the First World War, sadly, of an illness, which was a tragic loss. But he knew his ships very well. And the drawings, which many of you may recognize from Jane's fighting ships, were actually the basis of his naval war game. So he actually created this marvelous theoretical system whereby you could compare the capabilities of ships, much in the same way as wargamers do, using these stats. Now, Jane, of course, like any researcher in any era, was only as good as the information he was given at the time. Some of it is incorrect. In some cases, he was perhaps being deliberately misled. And in other cases, it was simply the case that people probably wanted to preserve security of their designs. But broadly speaking, Jane is a very accurate representation of ships of the time and their capabilities. And I want to draw your attention particularly to the number of watertight compartments you see down here. Now, this, just a health warning with these, this is not an accurate representation of the ship's watertight bulkheads. Jane abstracted this to record how much flotation ships had. And he has actually given Mikasa a rating of 17, so she can take that amount of flooding in his game. Compare this with the Kniaz Suvorov, which is given a very close rating of 16. So going by Jane, as I say, I think he got this right. The Mikasa has a very slight edge in flotation. But for the purposes of the game, Dreadnoughts, I think it actually works to give the two ships the same level of flotation capability, because the differences between the two in a game like this are actually really small change. So I do salute the designer's decision for just keeping it pretty simple. It also works in terms of the abstraction of the ship's tonnage and size. These two were not that far apart. Mikasa was somewhat heavier at somewhat over 15,000 tons fully loaded, while the Suvorov was only 13 and a bit thousand tons. But these things can only give you a general approximation in any case. Mikasa, of course, was slightly longer at 432 foot overall. Kniaz Suvorov was 397 foot. But the Kniaz Suvorov was slightly wider at 76 foot 2 inches, while the Mikasa was only 76 foot in the beam. So there you go. So what about the other elements? There's, of course, the armor ratings that are given, and these make for an interesting comparison too. Because when you look at the armor ratings on the main turrets, the secondary armament, and the hull, there are broad similarities, but there are also noticeable differences. Now, if you recall at the beginning of this video, I'd said that in terms of weight of armor overall, both ships carried a very similar arrangement. But if I can bring, both ships pretty much carried the same amount of armor, I should say. But if I bring up the illustrations in Jane's again, you can see the Japanese ship has its densest armor around the turret barbettes, and then it gradually lightens as you go around the hull. But what they've effectively got is this solid box of protection amidships. The ends have been very largely sacrificed with only nominal armour. And they've done the classic thing of having a curved protective deck to deflect shells over those spaces. But the really tough stuff is in the citadel of the ship. And you can see the lower tier of the ship's 6-inch armament, which is very well protected in that box. Of course, the casemate's armour is backed by 2 inches behind, as well as the 6 inches in front. The side armor, the belt armor, actually Jane gives it as 9 inches, but in places it was almost 10. But I suppose it's close enough for government work. And of course, the other thing Mikasa has, which is represented on her ship card, you'll note there's 2 conning towers, whereas the Suvorov has only 1. So there's the forward conning tower, which is quite well protected, and the after one, which is somewhat less so. So when you look at the Mikasa, you get the impression of a ship with a very balanced protection scheme, where some elements of the ship the armor has been sacrificed, but she is a very decently protected battleship. And I think this is very fairly represented in the game, where her turrets are given a rating of 6, her secondaries an armor rating of 5. Her conning tower has a very heavy armor rating of 8, the forward one at any rate, and the submerged torpedo tube 6. Hull armor for flotation starts off at 8. Now, when we look at the Kniaz Suvorov, the picture is very, very different. Because the first thing that strikes one at looking at this ship is that, yes, there are some very densely protected parts of the ship, but there are also large swathes where they have armor which is of only dubious effectiveness, I would suggest. So the turrets are, of course, heavily protected, and so are their trunks. This is very true of the main turret, and she has a very dense belt, but it's quite a thin belt. Now, I'd mentioned earlier that the Borodinos were in many respects, unfortunately, an inferior copy of the French Cesarovich design. This is most true in the arrangement of their armour. When you compare these with Cesarovich, not only is the belt thinner in the Borodinos, it's also narrower. So that strip of that thin strip of dense armor is not covering a very wide area. And of course, the great problem you have with a hull that's very high out of the water is you've got this vast swathe of unprotected hull. Just to emphasize the point, let's just look again at Mikasa, at that very solid looking box you have between the turrets. And let's go back to Kniaz Suvorov, where you've got that almost nominal hull protection and then this great big emptiness up here. And I'd just like to point out the secondary armament is not very well served by the armor at all. The turrets themselves are very decently protected. There's 6 inches of armor there covering those. But look at the lighter shading of their ammunition hoist and magazine trunking. That is worryingly thin, and it's quite easy, I would suggest, for one of these to be taken offline by a hit anywhere in the vicinity here, which prevented its reloading systems from operating. There is, of course, also the potential for magazine fires. So the Russian armor scheme left a lot to be desired, even though in places it was very good. And to make matters worse, at Tsushima, because of the distance the Russians had to travel, their ships were overloaded with coal and other stores, so much so that their already thin armor belt was actually submerged. Now, not by much. We're talking about 5 feet increase in depth, going by the statistics that we have for the Orel, which was one of the Kniaz Suvorov's sister ships. But when you look at how thin or how short, I should say, that armor belt is, a 5 foot submersion is actually really, really bad news because your heavy armor is now disappearing below your waterline and it's leaving other stuff that's not very well protected up there. So that's not ideal. And the problem with the Russian armor is actually represented very well in this game. So although the weaponry enjoys comparable protection and the conning tower as well, it's slightly weaker. When you look at the flotation rating for the Russian ship, it starts off at 6. And if you're playing a Tsushima scenario, there's a special rule built in to reduce this even further. With the greatest respect to the Borodino class, I think the designers did get that one right. Their armor protection was one of their Achilles' heels. But what about armament? So much for the defensive strength. Let's look at the hitting power next. And in terms of the weaponry they counted that mattered in a naval battle, these two ships were remarkably well balanced. Each of them were armed with a primary battery of 4 12-inch 40 caliber guns mounted in twin turrets, one forward, one aft. I've touched on the secondaries, but just a reminder, so that Mikasa has 14 6-inch 45 caliber guns, and hers are disposed in the box battery within their own casemates. The Suvorov has 12 6-inch 45 caliber guns, but hers are placed in the aforementioned turrets. It's not so easy to see there, so what I might do is bring back this spectacular photograph of her, so you can see one turret, another turret, and then a third turret back there. So these are the secondary turrets on those sides. Now, I'd suggest, in terms of the main armament, both sides were, generally speaking, very well matched, except, and I've had this very interesting tidbit shared with me by the designers, they have given the Kniaz Suvorov a bonus to its firing. There's two reasons for this. The one they've mainly touched on in the design of this game is the fact that, being the younger ship, the Suvorov's guns are a bit more modern and the mountings are a bit more modern. There's also the fact, and you can see it quite clearly from the illustration, that they do enjoy a slightly better command than the Mikasa's turret, in certainly where the forward turrets are concerned. And there's actually not that much to choose between the after one. So between the modernity and the better command, the rating, I think, is a fair one. In terms of their penetration as well, the Russian guns have a very, very slight advantage at close ranges, but it's slightly offset by equivalent Japanese advantages in crew training and crew ratings. But looking purely at the guns, the Russians rightly have a better rating for their primaries. In terms of their range and penetration, their secondary guns are completely identical. That's a very interesting design choice, because in theory, the French and the French and Russian approach to these things, which was to have these weatherproofed turrets mounted very high up, gives you a slightly better command overall. But control of these turrets was problematic in a battle. They never quite they never quite enjoyed the same level of centralized control that the British design did. So the arrangement in a British design battleship was not as weatherproof as the Franco-Russian ones were. The guns are often closer to the waterline, so bad weather can affect them. But having them all in the same sort of space simplifies communication and concentration of fire. So between those two elements, I think it's fair that the secondary guns have balanced each other out. And lastly, we have the torpedo armament. So the Japanese torpedoes are given a much better range and higher level of damage in this game than their Russian counterparts. Again, I think this is fair, and the designers have justified the decision by rightly pointing out that the Mikasa's torpedoes are the Japanese Type 37 long-range weapons with a range of about 3,000 yards. That was really impressive for the first decade of the 20th century. The Russian ones, by comparison, are the older 1898 pattern with a much shorter range, only 700 yards or thereabouts. Even worse, although both battleships carried 4 torpedo tubes, the Japanese mounted theirs 2 on each broadside in well-protected submerged mountings. The Russian torpedoes, one was mounted above water in the bow, the other above water in the stern, and the remainder were in submerged positions within the hull. Those latter were as well protected as the Mikasa's, but it does mean that in a broadside to broadside engagement, the Japanese ship has the potential to throw 2 torpedoes out of its tubes at you, whereas the Russian vessel can only respond with 1 of its much shorter ranged and less effective weapons. So there you go. That's the weaponry, and I think again the designers have modelled the differences very well by giving the Japanese a hitting advantage, a longer range, and much greater damage in the event that their torpedoes hit. That's an important consideration in this era, which again the game deals with really, really well. So that brings us now to the speed rating of the 2 ships. They've both been rated a 6. Now, in a Tsushima scenario, a penalty is applied to the Russian speed rating because of the disadvantage they suffer, the long voyage, the condition of their hulls, the state of the Suvorov's boilers in particular, and a myriad of other problems which had degraded the fighting efficiency of their fleet, whereas the Japanese were completely fresh at Tsushima. That was a major factor in them winning that battle. But taking this to represent the Suvorov as designed, is an equal speed fair? Well, basically, yes, it is. The fastest recorded speed Mikasa ever made was 18 knots, and she maintained that very well when she was new. The equivalent speed for the Suvorov was 17.8 knots. Very, very, very close. She did have trouble reaching that subsequently in the course of her tragically short life. I mean, generally speaking, you're dealing with vertical triple expansion engines here. The wear on the machinery can be quite serious. You wouldn't really want to run your ships at full power unless you really had to, and certainly not for sustained periods. Both ships, in ideal conditions, could have probably maintained 15 knots happily for as long as their coal held up. But you wouldn't want to go much faster than that unless you had to. And even at the Battle of Tsushima, the Japanese don't really open the throttle to the full throughout the battle. They do it very selectively. But in terms of the design capabilities and what they could do as new, an equal speed rating is a fair one. So there were not too many other things to touch on, really. We've covered all the bases. I just want to mention a few more special rules that the designers have built in because they are worth talking about. In the game, rangefinders are important. Both these ships had equivalent rangefinders as designed, and as the rangefinders of the same capacity for range taking and for the accuracy of their range taking. So they both have an equivalent rangefinder bonus, which is right. Special abilities or special features. The Japanese have Shimose ammunition, which again is a correct representation. These were essentially high explosive shells, so not good for sinking ships necessarily because they couldn't penetrate heavy armor, but they could start fires, which could be a serious, serious hazard, even in this period. So the presence of Shimose ammunition on the Japanese ships with the consequent rules for modeling that are very well done in this game. Unfortunately for the Kniaz Suvorov, it's a penalty really. She suffers extra flotation damage from torpedoes or mining. And the reason for that is back to the inherent instability of that French-inspired tumble home design. It worked well enough if there was nothing wrong with the ship, but there was always a danger in this kind of design where the meta center was really high, that any kind of damage would severely affect the stability of the ship. In particular, underwater damage, because flooding would have catastrophic effects. And in fact, you see this during the battle when the Imperator Alexander III, a sister of the Kniaz Suvorov, sinks very quickly as a result of flooding from heavy shell hits near her waterline. In fact, actually, the fates of all four of the ships at the battle are almost a menagerie of what could go wrong with this class. And the Borodino suffers from a magazine explosion, which dooms her. The Suvorov herself was very badly battered by shell fire during the battle and finally finished off later by torpedoes. The Mikasa, by contrast, stood up to the damage she took fairly well, but over the course of the battle, although she was hit, particularly in the early stages, she did not suffer anything like the beating that the Russian ships took. And so while her protection systems were tested, they certainly weren't tested to anything approaching destruction. So there we have it, my very quick cook's tour of these two ships. I've said it often enough over the course of this video. I think that the representation of these two ships is very fair. The Russians are a bit hobbled by the limitations of their design, but the Borodino class still has enough going for them that they can put up a very respectable fight. And despite their problems, they still are pretty fine ships. All of this, I think, is well represented in this game. I've played one-on-one battles between these two a fair number of times now. I do think the designers are to be congratulated again for creating such a wonderfully simple and yet very accurate representation of naval warfare in this period. And so on that happy note, I think I will wrap this one up. To Rolf and Nick, guys, very well done. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on the design inspiration and your design process. That was really appreciated. For the rest of you who are watching, thank you so much for joining me on this series. It's really good to be back, and I've been looking forward to making this episode for a long time, so I hope you enjoy it. To all my veterans, a very warm hello to you all, and to anyone who's new to the channel, whatever's brought you here, whether it's a love of wargaming or naval history, I hope you've enjoyed this, and I hope that you'll check out some of my other videos in the Ships of War series. But I'll close this one now with just a huge thank you to you all for the pleasure of your company and for tuning in, and I really look forward to seeing you all in the next video. Take care. Bye.